It started quietly, the way most neighborhood disputes do, not with a bang, but with a letter slipped into the mailbox, printed on crisp white paper with the HOA's embossed logo in the corner. At first glance, it looked harmless enough. Just another notice from the Homeowners Association, probably about trash pickup schedules or landscaping reminders. But the bold red lettering at the top, "Notice of Violation," made the homeowner stop and read every word. According to the letter, the HOA had found unapproved modifications to the property. The offense: a new garden bed, neatly arranged along the front porch, blooming with marigolds, lavender, and a small row of decorative stones. The homeowner had spent a quiet weekend building it, unaware that such a small act of beautification could trigger a bureaucratic storm. The letter cited several sections of the community's covenant rules, mentioning terms like architectural review and unauthorized changes to landscaping. It demanded immediate correction, threatening a fine of $500 per day if the violation was not addressed within 72 hours. At first, the homeowner thought it must be a mistake. After all, other neighbors had similar gardens. Some even had small fountains or decorative benches. Surely, this was just a mix-up, a misunderstanding. But when the second letter came 3 days later, the tone was different. It was colder. It referenced the previous warning and declared that fines had already begun accruing. The total was now $1,500, due within 10 days. The homeowner's stomach dropped. Confused and frustrated, the homeowner walked the neighborhood that evening. The air smelled like cut grass and grill smoke. Houses stood in perfect uniformity, identical mailboxes, neatly trimmed hedges, and a sense of forced harmony that only a strict HOA could enforce. Yet, as the homeowner walked, it became clear that others had their own modifications. A neighbor with a bird bath, another with an unapproved color of mulch. The realization came slowly. Rules here weren't enforced equally. Over the next week, the letters kept coming, each one more aggressive than the last. The HOA's tone shifted from polite to threatening. They cited noncompliance, breach of community contract, and eventually, intent to place a lien. Each envelope felt heavier than the one before, filled not only with paper, but with anxiety and disbelief. Phone calls to the HOA office led nowhere. The management company that handled the neighborhood's affairs always had the same response. The violation stood, and the fines would continue. Requests for a meeting were ignored. Emails went unanswered. It became clear that the HOA board, the small group of residents who ran the association, had no intention of budging. The homeowner began to investigate. The first step was reviewing the HOA's bylaws, a thick packet tucked away in a drawer since moving in. Late nights were spent reading through every clause, every amendment, every vague rule about property aesthetics. The language was confusing, deliberately so. But buried deep in the text was something interesting, a requirement that all violation notices must include photographic evidence of the infraction and proof of prior approval requests denied in writing. None of the letters the homeowner received contained any of that. That was the first crack in the armor. Encouraged, the homeowner began documenting everything. Every letter, every email, every call log. Photos of the garden, time-stamped and dated. Screenshots of neighbors' properties with similar decorations. The HOA claimed to enforce rules for community uniformity, but the evidence painted a different picture, one of selective enforcement and arbitrary punishments. Meanwhile, the fines continued to grow. By the end of the month, the total exceeded $10,000. The HOA tacked on additional administrative fees, making the bill even higher. The homeowner could barely sleep, haunted by the fear that the association might actually follow through with their threat to place a lien on the home. But then, a strange thing happened. A neighbor, quiet and cautious, knocked on the door one evening. They, too, had received a notice. Different issue, same tone. Something about their driveway needing to be resurfaced to meet visual standards. And another neighbor had been fined for leaving a recycling bin visible for too long. One by one, stories began to surface. People whispered about the HOA president, a retired accountant named Greg, who seemed to wield the rulebook like a weapon. Greg had been on the board for years, running unopposed, and was known for his temper and his obsession with property values. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated case. It was a pattern. The HOA had been targeting residents with baseless fines for months, maybe years. Most people simply paid them to avoid trouble. But now, with evidence piling up, the homeowner began to wonder what would happen if someone pushed back. The decision came late one night, as the homeowner sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups. A search online revealed that in their state, homeowners could take their HOA to small claims court for damages under certain conditions, especially if the HOA had violated its own rules or acted in bad faith. The idea sparked like a flame. The next morning, the homeowner filed a formal request for records under state HOA transparency laws, demanding access to meeting minutes, enforcement logs, and financial statements. It was a bold move, one the HOA wasn't expecting. Within a week, a terse email arrived from Greg himself, accusing the homeowner of harassment and abuse of administrative resources. But legally, the HOA was required to comply. When the records finally came in, a box of poorly organized papers and USB drives. It was like opening Pandora's box. Hidden among the files were inconsistencies, missing approvals, fines issued without due process, and even expenses that didn't make sense. Payments labeled as consulting fees to companies with suspiciously generic names. The deeper the homeowner dug, the clearer it became. Something wasn't right. The homeowner spent nights compiling a timeline, matching each violation to the HOA's internal logs. It turned out that their so-called violation had never been officially voted on by the board. According to their own records, the enforcement committee meeting that supposedly approved the fine had never even taken place. The discovery was a turning point. Now, it wasn't just about the garden or the fines, it was about accountability. The homeowner wasn't just defending a flower bed anymore. They were uncovering a pattern of negligence, maybe even corruption. The anger that once came from fear now turned into quiet determination. By the time the next HOA meeting was scheduled, the homeowner had everything ready. A binder full of evidence, copies of legal statutes, and a formal notice of intent to file a claim in small claims court. The plan was simple: expose the truth and make them answer for every unfair fine, every ignored request, every letter meant to intimidate. As the meeting date approached, the neighborhood buzzed with rumors. Some whispered that the homeowner was reckless. Others, secretly fed up with the HOA's behavior, were quietly rooting for them. The tension built like pressure in a sealed jar. When the night of the meeting finally came, the homeowner arrived early, documents in hand. The board members sat at the front of the room, smug and dismissive. Greg smirked, already assuming victory. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the homeowner had found something in those records that could change everything. Something the HOA never expected anyone to see. Something that could make them pay. The HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with beige walls, folding chairs, and a faint smell of air freshener and disinfectant. The fluorescent lights buzzed quietly above, setting a tense, artificial mood. Residents filed in one by one, murmuring in low tones, clutching copies of the agenda. It was supposed to be a routine meeting, budget reviews, landscaping updates, general announcements. But everyone knew it wouldn't be. The homeowner sat near the back, binder resting on their lap, watching as the board members settled into their seats. At the center was Greg, the HOA president, his expression tight with practiced authority. On either side sat the treasurer, secretary, and two other board members, their faces unreadable. The meeting opened with pleasantries and procedural motions, but the tension in the air was heavy enough to choke on. Everyone could feel it. Something was coming. Halfway through the agenda, during the open forum portion, the homeowner rose and walked to the front. Chairs creaked as heads turned. The board members stiffened. Greg leaned back, folding his arms. The homeowner placed the binder on the podium and began reading from a prepared statement, outlining every detail of what had happened. The warning letters, the escalating fines, the ignored communications. The tone was calm, deliberate, but underneath was a controlled anger that made every word cut deeper. Then came the evidence. Page after page, the homeowner cited the HOA's own bylaws, pointing out where the board had failed to follow them. There had been no vote authorizing enforcement, no photographic evidence attached to the violation notice, no record of approval requests being reviewed. Every requirement for due process had been skipped. Each violation letter, the homeowner explained, was invalid under the association's own governing documents. First, Greg tried to interrupt. He called it misinformation, accused the homeowner of misinterpreting the rules. But the homeowner didn't stop. They turned a page, held up a printed email, and read from it verbatim. An internal correspondence between board members discussing increasing enforcement activity to boost revenue. That word, revenue, hung in the air like a spark in a gas leak. The crowd stirred. Residents began whispering to each other, shocked. One woman in the front row frowned, whispering something to her husband. Another man pulled out his phone, recording quietly from his seat. The board exchanged nervous glances, but the homeowner wasn't finished. They flipped to another section of the binder, a printed spreadsheet from the financial records the HOA had reluctantly provided. It showed thousands of dollars in consulting and legal review fees paid to a company called G&L Property Management Solutions. The homeowner paused, then explained that a quick search of the state business registry revealed that this company didn't exist, at least, not legally. There was no registered address, no tax ID, no business filings. But there was something else. The initials G and L matched two names perfectly, Greg and Linda. The HOA president and treasurer. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone muttered under their breath. Another person demanded to see the document. Greg's face flushed red. The treasurer fidgeted with her papers, avoiding eye contact in that moment. The power dynamic shifted. The homeowner, once the target, now stood in control. Calmly, they stated that a formal small claims court filing had already been prepared, citing the HOA for improper enforcement, unlawful fines, and potential financial misconduct. Copies of the complaint had been sent to the HOA's management company and the state's HOA Oversight Division. Greg slammed his palm on the table, voice rising, declaring that the homeowner was making baseless accusations. But the damage was done. The residents weren't buying it anymore. The whispers turned into murmurs of outrage. People started demanding answers. One woman in the back stood up and asked if the board had been pocketing association funds. Another man wanted to know how many people had been unfairly fined. The meeting dissolved into chaos. The board called for order, but no one listened. Residents surrounded them, demanding transparency, demanding records. Someone pulled up the HOA's online portal, showing proof that fines had been charged inconsistently across the neighborhood. Another resident confirmed that their fine had been reversed after complaining loudly, a sign of arbitrary enforcement. Greg tried to adjourn the meeting, but even that didn't work. People were shouting now, their voices echoing off the walls. The homeowner stood back and watched, feeling both adrenaline and vindication. For the first time, the community saw what had been happening behind closed doors. The fear that once silenced everyone had cracked wide open in the days that followed. The fallout was immediate. Emails circulated through the neighborhood. Copies of the evidence, meeting recordings, and screenshots from the HOA's internal files. The board issued a statement calling the allegations misunderstandings, promising an internal review. But the residents weren't convinced. They called for a special election to remove Greg and other board members. Petitions began circulating door to door. Meanwhile, the homeowner filed the small claims court case, attaching every piece of evidence meticulously organized, letters, logs, and excerpts from the HOA's own documents. The claim sought repayment for every dollar of the fines, damages for stress and harassment, and reimbursement for court fees. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about accountability. Weeks passed. The HOA scrambled to respond, hiring an attorney, though small claims court didn't technically require one. They tried to negotiate quietly, offering to waive the fines if the lawsuit was dropped. But the homeowner refused. It wasn't just their fight anymore. Other residents had come forward with similar stories. Fines for invisible weeds, for wind chimes, for patio furniture that didn't match community standards. It had been systematic. The trial date was set. The courtroom was small, with faded carpet and a faint echo that made every sound feel more dramatic than it should have. On one side sat the homeowner, calm and prepared. On the other, the HOA board, Greg included, looking uncomfortable in suits that didn't quite fit. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, listened patiently as each side presented their case. The HOA argued that they were within their rights to enforce community standards, that the homeowner had ignored the process. But when pressed for proof, they couldn't provide the required meeting minutes or photographic evidence. The judge frowned, asking where the official vote record was. The HOA's lawyer stammered. There was none. Then came the financial question. The homeowner presented the spreadsheet showing payments to G&L Property Management Solutions. The judge asked the HOA's attorney to explain. Silence filled the room. Greg avoided eye contact. The attorney fumbled for words, eventually admitting that he couldn't verify the legitimacy of the company. That was the moment everything fell apart for the HOA. The judge ruled that the HOA had acted improperly and without due process, voiding all fines and ordering full reimbursement to the homeowner. In addition, the HOA was ordered to pay damages for stress and administrative abuse. The total wasn't massive, just a few $1,000s, but the message was devastating. The HOA's credibility was shattered. When the decision was announced, Greg's face went pale. The residents in attendance exchanged knowing looks. For the homeowner, it wasn't triumph that filled the moment, it was relief. Relief that months of fear and frustration had finally led somewhere. But the story wasn't over yet. Word of the judgment spread through the community like wildfire. Local news picked up the story after residents began posting online about the HOA that fined its own neighbors into bankruptcy. The management company quietly terminated its contract with the board. Greg and Linda resigned within weeks, citing personal reasons. The neighborhood stood at a crossroads. For years, people had lived under the HOA's shadow, afraid to speak up. Now, that shadow was gone. But what would replace it? As the homeowners sat on their porch one quiet evening, the garden blooming softly in the evening light, a new letter arrived. This time, not from the HOA, but from a neighbor. It was a handwritten note thanking them for standing up, for not backing down when everyone else had. The homeowner smiled. The fight had been brutal, but worth it. Still, something lingered, a sense that the story wasn't fully over yet. The court case might have ended, but the community had a lot of rebuilding to do. The board might be gone, but questions remained about the money that had vanished and how deep the corruption really went. The homeowner closed their eyes, listening to the faint hum of crickets and sprinklers. The war with the HOA had ended, but the aftermath was just beginning to in the weeks following the court victory. The neighborhood entered a strange kind of calm, a silence that felt both peaceful and uneasy, as though everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The HOA board had crumbled. Greg and Linda had resigned in disgrace, their names practically taboo in community conversations. Two other board members quietly followed, unwilling to face the growing anger of the residents. For the first time in years, the association's power seemed to vanish overnight. But with the collapse came confusion. No one knew who was in charge anymore. The management company had terminated its contract, leaving administrative duties in limbo. The HOA's official email auto-replied with a message that read, "We are currently undergoing leadership restructuring." It was corporate code for chaos. The homeowner, now something of a local hero, tried to stay out of the spotlight. The court ruling had been satisfying enough. Fines dismissed, damages paid, and the HOA's practices exposed. But the fallout was spreading faster than anyone expected. Local reporters had picked up the story, and it had gone semi-viral online. Homeowner beats HOA in small claims court, exposes corruption. Comment sections filled with outrage, sympathy, and stories from other people across the country who had faced similar battles. The homeowner's quiet suburban street had become a symbol of resistance against HOA abuse. Still, as much as the victory felt good, something gnawed at the homeowner. During the trial, there had been questions the HOA never answered, especially about the missing funds tied to G&L Property Management Solutions. The judge had ruled on the immediate violations, but the deeper issue, the potential financial misconduct, hadn't been fully explored. And now that Greg and Linda had disappeared, there was little oversight left, so the homeowner kept digging. The first step was reaching out to the county's property and business registries again, verifying every trace of those consulting payments. What surfaced next was shocking. Multiple payments over the span of 3 years totaling more than $60,000, all made out to that non-existent company. The money had been withdrawn from the HOA's reserve fund, the one meant for maintenance and emergency repairs. No contractor invoices, no service records, nothing but a paper trail that ended in blank signatures. It became clear that Greg and Linda had been running a shell operation. They had likely created a fake company, funneling HOA funds into it, while justifying the transfers as management expenses. And because no one ever questioned them, they got away with it. Until now, the homeowner compiled everything, every bank statement, every transfer, every record from the HOA's own files. Then they reached out to a local investigative journalist who had covered the small claims court story. Within days, the reporter visited the neighborhood, camera crew in tow, recording interviews and scanning through evidence. The homeowner handed over copies of everything. The segment aired a week later, and it spread like wildfire. The headline was simple but devastating. HOA officials accused of embezzling thousands from residents. The story hit every local news outlet, then spread online again. Former board members were suddenly in the spotlight, and residents began demanding a full audit of the HOA's finances. The state's Department of Consumer Affairs even opened an inquiry into the association's practices. Then, one morning, an unmarked envelope appeared in the homeowner's mailbox. No return address, no name. Inside was a typed letter with no signature. It read, "You don't know what you've started. Stop digging." No explanation, no threats, just those 5 words that it could have been nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. The homeowner reported it to local police, who took a statement but didn't have much to go on. Still, it was enough to spark unease. For a few days, the homeowner kept the lights on later than usual, double-checked locks, and watched for unfamiliar cars. But fear quickly gave way to determination. If someone wanted to silence them, it only meant they were close to something important. The investigation deepened. Reporters uncovered that Greg and Linda had quietly sold their house and left town 2 weeks after resigning. The trail of financial misconduct grew longer. Missing maintenance contracts, fake expense reports, even personal purchases made on the HOA's account. The community, once tightly controlled by fear of fines, now united in outrage that a new board was formed, this time democratically elected. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now worked together to rebuild trust. The homeowner was asked to join, but politely declined, choosing instead to serve as an informal advisor. They had fought their battle and won. Now, it was time for others to take the reins. The audit confirmed what everyone suspected. Over $75,000 in community funds had been stolen over the course of 4 years. The new board filed a civil suit against Greg and Linda, forwarding the evidence to law enforcement. Within months, charges were filed for embezzlement and fraud. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through the county. Greg and Linda, once self-appointed gatekeepers of the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity, were now defendants facing potential jail time. Neighbors who had once been fined for trivial infractions like mailbox colors or flower beds gathered outside the courthouse, watching justice finally catch up. The homeowner attended one hearing quietly, sitting in the back row as the prosecutor detailed the financial scheme. Hearing it spoken aloud was surreal, a reminder of how far things had come from that first letter about a garden bed. When the sentence was finally handed down, probation, restitution, and permanent removal from any future HOA involvement, it felt like the closing of a long, exhausting chapter. Months later, life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. The new HOA board abolished daily fines, introduced transparent budgeting, and opened all future meetings to residents. For the first time, the community actually felt like a community. The homeowner's garden remained untouched, a small patch of color and defiance, now a quiet symbol of what had been overcome. Sometimes, people walking by would stop to compliment it, not realizing the story behind it. Other times, new residents would ask about the HOA scandal like it was local folklore. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. This time, not a warning or threat, but an official check. It was a reimbursement payment from the HOA's insurance policy, covering damages from the lawsuit and embezzlement case. The amount wasn't life-changing, but it was poetic justice. The HOA that had once fined them $500 a day was now paying them back. The homeowner laughed quietly as they held the check, feeling the weight of it. Not just the money, but the meaning. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about principle, about standing up when everyone else stayed quiet. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops and the neighborhood lights flickered on, the homeowner sat on the porch, coffee in hand, looking out over the same peaceful street that had once been a battleground. The garden swayed gently in the breeze, marigolds glowing orange against the fading light, that IT was over now. The fines, the fear, the constant tension, all of it gone. What remained was a lesson etched deep into the fabric of the community. That power unchecked becomes abuse, and that sometimes the only way to reclaim peace is to fight for it. The homeowner smiled, knowing they had done just that, and in the end, made the HOA literally pay for every ounce of their arrogance.